I retired 3 years ago, and I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I was wrong. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, and I have been married to my wife, Margaret, for 38 years. We built everything together, the house, the savings, the life. We were not rich, but we were stable. We were safe, or so I believed. Margaret is 61. She has brown eyes that still catch light the same way they did when I met her at a community picnic in 1986. She laughs quietly, cooks too much food whenever anyone visits, and has never once in her life asked for more than what she needed. She is the kind of woman who apologizes when someone bumps into her, the kind who leaves thank you notes for the mail carrier at Christmas. I want you to remember that about her, because what I am about to tell you only makes sense if you understand who she is. We have one son, Daniel. He is 34 years old. I used to say that Daniel was our greatest achievement. I used to say it out loud, at dinner tables, to neighbors, to anyone who asked. He was sharp in school, charming in conversation, and when he smiled at you, you felt chosen. That is the only word for it. You felt chosen. He moved to Seattle after college, built a career in sales, married a woman named Trina, who I always found a little cold but said nothing about, and for about 8 years, we saw him maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Holidays. The occasional birthday. He would call on Sundays sometimes, and Margaret would light up for the rest of the day after those calls. Then, 2 years ago, things started to fall apart for Daniel. He told us the marriage had broken down. He told us his company had downsized and eliminated his position. He told us he needed a fresh start. He asked if he could come back to Portland for a few months, just to get back on his feet. He said, 3 months, maybe 4. Margaret said yes before I even had a chance to form an opinion. I remember watching her face, the relief, the joy, the way her whole body seemed lighter just knowing he was coming home. I did not say no. I could not say no to that face. So Daniel came home in March of last year. And for the first few weeks, it was good. It was genuinely good. He helped around the house. He cooked breakfast on Saturdays. He sat with us in the evenings and watched old movies and made Margaret laugh in a way I had missed without realizing I had missed it. I work part-time now as a consultant. 3 days a week, a few hours at a time. It keeps my mind sharp and gets me out of the house. Margaret has mild arthritis in both hands and a heart condition that her cardiologist monitors closely. Nothing immediately dangerous, but something we are careful about. She does not drive anymore. She spends most of her days at home. I want you to understand what that means. I want you to understand what it means that Daniel was home with her during the days I was gone. The first sign came in May. I came home on a Tuesday afternoon and found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, very still, hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. She was not crying. She was not upset in any visible way. She was just absent, like she had stepped out of herself and left her body sitting there. I asked her what was wrong. She said nothing was wrong. I asked if something had happened. She said she was just tired. I made her tea and sat with her, and she gradually came back to herself. And by dinner she was talking normally, and I told myself it was the arthritis, or the medication, or just a hard day. I told myself a lot of things in those months. The second sign came in June. Margaret mentioned, very casually, that she had called her sister Ruth in Tucson, and that the call had not gone through. I did not think much of it until Ruth called me on my cell phone 2 weeks later asking why Margaret had not been returning her calls. Ruth said she had called the house phone 4 or 5 times, and no one answered. She said she had left voicemails. I checked the house phone that evening. The voicemail inbox was empty. Every message deleted. When I asked Margaret about it, she looked confused. She said she had not heard the phone ring. She said she did not know anything about voicemails. I told myself the phone was malfunctioning. I told myself I would look into it. I did not look into it the way I should have. The third sign came in August, and by then I was already beginning to feel a low, constant unease that I could not name. Margaret asked me, hesitantly, over breakfast one morning, whether we had money to cover the property tax payment coming up in October. It was an odd question. Margaret had never worried about money in that particular way. She trusted me to handle it, and I always had. But she was not asking from curiosity. She was asking from fear. I told her yes, of course, we were fine. I asked her why she was worried. She said Daniel had mentioned something about our retirement account, that the market had been rough, that maybe we should think about liquidating some investments. I set down my coffee cup. I asked her when she and Daniel had talked about our retirement account. She looked uncomfortable. She said it had just come up in conversation. She said he was only trying to help. That evening I sat in my office and I opened our financial accounts on my computer and I went through everything. The retirement account was untouched. The checking account, the savings account, everything was as I expected. I found nothing alarming, but I could not shake the feeling. It sat in my chest like a stone. I am an engineer by training. I believe in data. I believe in evidence. I had installed a security system in our home 6 years ago after a break-in 2 houses down the street. 4 cameras, front door, back door, the main living area, and the garage. I used to check them occasionally, mostly out of habit, mostly to confirm that the world was still as quiet as it appeared. I had not checked them in months. I do not know what made me open the app that night. I do not know if it was intuition or anxiety or just the particular way Margaret had looked when she mentioned the retirement account. But I opened the app and I started scrolling back through the footage. What I found changed everything. The footage from a Wednesday in July. I had been at a client meeting in Beaverton, an all-day thing. I had texted Margaret at lunchtime to check in and she had replied with a simple, "I'm fine, enjoy your day." On the camera, I could see the living room from a high angle. Margaret was sitting in her usual chair, the green one by the window, with a book in her lap. Daniel came in from the hallway. He was not angry, not visibly. He sat down across from her with what looked like a stack of papers. There is no audio on my system. I watched them talk. I watched Margaret shake her head slowly. I watched Daniel lean forward and point at something on the papers. I watched Margaret shake her head again. And then I watched Daniel stand up and take the papers away and say something I cannot know exactly what, but I know what a person looks like when they are not making a request anymore. He was not asking. He was telling. Margaret sat very still after he left the room. She did not go back to her book for a long time. I went back further. A Monday in June. I had been at the office. Margaret was in the kitchen and Daniel came in and sat at the table with his laptop. They talked. Then Daniel turned the laptop toward her. She looked at it. She pulled back. He pushed it closer. She looked at it again, and then she got up and went to the sink and stood there with her back to him, and I could see by the set of her shoulders that she was either crying or trying very hard not to. He closed the laptop and left the room without looking at her. I sat in my office until well past midnight watching footage. I saw Margaret answer the house phone in early July, speak for a moment, and then I saw Daniel come in and take the phone from her hand, not violently, but firmly, and end the call himself. Margaret stood there and watched him do it. She did not protest. I saw Daniel go through Margaret's purse on a Thursday morning in July while she was in the shower. He took out her debit card, looked at it, held it for a moment, then put it back. He did not take anything, but he looked at it like a man who is deciding something. I saw, on a Friday afternoon, Daniel on his phone in the garage for a long time. I have no footage with audio, but I watched him pace and gesture, and at one point press his hand over his eyes in a way that looked like desperation or frustration or both. I did not sleep that night. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think it matters. I did not feel only anger. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was a kind of grief that I had no framework for. A grief that came from looking at my son, who I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway of this very house, who I had sat with in the emergency room when he broke his wrist at 13, who I had driven to college with his belongings packed in the back of my truck, and seeing a stranger, not a stranger who had wandered in from outside, a stranger who had been there all along, underneath, and I had simply never had reason to look. I called my brother-in-law, Margaret's brother, Frank, the following morning when Daniel was out. Frank is a retired police officer, and the most level-headed person I know. I told him what I had seen. I did not editorialize. I just described the footage. Frank was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Gary, this is financial elder abuse. You understand that, right?" I had not said that word to myself yet. I had been using other words. Concern, manipulation, pressure. Frank said the word plainly, and it landed like something physical. He told me not to confront Daniel yet. He told me to document everything first. He told me to call an attorney, and to call our bank, and to talk to Margaret when I had a clearer picture of what had actually happened financially. I spent the next 4 days gathering information. I called our bank. I spoke with the branch manager, a woman named Patricia, who pulled our account history and walked me through every transaction. The accounts were intact. But there had been 2 instances where Margaret had visited the branch, once in June and once in July, and both times Daniel had been with her. Patricia said that on the July visit, Daniel had attempted to add himself to the account as a co-holder. Margaret had not signed the paperwork. Patricia said the visit ended abruptly, and that the teller on duty had noted, in the internal record, that the older female customers seemed distressed. My wife had walked into our bank in distress, and no one had called me. I understand they could not legally, not without Margaret's permission. I understand that. But I sat with that information for a long time. I called an estate attorney. I had a consultation over the phone and explained the situation. The attorney told me that what I was describing, isolation from family, pressure to access financial accounts, monitoring and controlling behavior, constituted a pattern consistent with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She told me about Oregon's laws. She told me what documentation I would need. She told me this was more common than most people know, and that it was also, in her words, among the most painful cases she encountered, precisely because the perpetrator was almost always family. That word again. Almost always family. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Margaret. I waited until a Sunday morning when Daniel had driven to the gym. I made coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and I took her hands in mine, and I looked at her, and I said her name. She looked at me, and I could see immediately that she knew something was happening. She has known me for 38 years. She knows the difference between my ordinary face and the face I wear when something is serious. She said, "Gary, don't." I said, "Margaret, I need you to tell me what has been going on." She was quiet for a very long time. She looked down at our hands, and I watched her make a decision. I could almost see the exact moment she made it. And then she looked up and she started to talk. She told me that Daniel had come to her in April, about 3 weeks after moving in, and explained that he was in serious debt. Not from the divorce, not from the job loss. He had made investments, private ones, without consulting Trina, and they had failed catastrophically. He owed money to people he described as private lenders. He said he was afraid. He said he was ashamed. He said he did not want me to know because he knew how I would react. Margaret had believed him. Of course she had believed him. He was her son, and he was frightened, and she is the woman who leaves thank-you notes for the mail carrier. He had asked her not to tell me. He had told her they could handle it quietly, between themselves, that all he needed was access to a small portion of our savings. Just a loan, he called it, a loan he would repay, and that no one needed to know, and everything would be fine. Margaret had said no. She had said no the first time, and the second time, and the third. But Daniel had kept coming back. And each time he came back, he was a little less like a son asking, and a little more like something else. He began to mention her heart condition. He began to say things like, "Stress isn't good for you, Mom," in contexts that were not about stress. He deleted Ruth's voicemails because, he told her, Ruth was a negative influence who made her anxiety worse. He sat with her at the bank because, he said, he wanted to make sure she was not confused by anything. He had not struck her. He had not screamed at her. He had done something that left no bruises, which is precisely why it had taken me so long to see it. Margaret was crying by the time she finished. Not the loud, visible crying of someone who wants to be seen, the quiet, exhausted kind that comes from a person who has been holding something heavy for too long. She said, "I didn't want to make things worse." She said, "I thought he would stop." She said, "I was afraid of what he would do if I made him angry." I held her hands, and I did not say anything for a little while because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. Then I told her that I was going to handle it. I told her she did not have to be afraid anymore. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I meant every word. Daniel came home from the gym about 2 hours later. I was sitting in the living room, not reading, not watching television, simply sitting. He came in and looked at me, and something in my face must have communicated what was happening because he stopped in the doorway. He said, "Dad, what's going on?" I told him to sit down. He sat. I told him that I knew everything. I told him about the camera footage. I told him about the bank. I told him about my conversation with Margaret. I spoke quietly, and I spoke clearly, and I did not raise my voice. He did not confess immediately. He tried, for about 10 minutes, to reframe what had happened. He said, I had misunderstood. He said Margaret was confused, that her memory was not reliable, that I was making accusations based on video footage taken out of context. He said I had always been controlling, and that this was just another example of me not trusting him. I let him finish. Then I told him that I had already spoken to an attorney. I told him that I had already spoken to our bank. I told him that I had copies of every piece of camera footage, saved in 3 different locations, and that I had a written account from Margaret, which she had agreed to provide. I told him that if he had any interest in resolving this without involving law enforcement, he would need to leave our home by the end of the week, and he would need to agree, in writing, to have no unsupervised contact with Margaret. The reframing stopped. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said something I will not forget. He said, You have no idea what kind of trouble I'm in. I said, That is no longer my problem to solve. He left the room. He went upstairs. I sat where I was. He left the house the next morning. He loaded his car while I stood in the doorway and watched. He did not look at me when he backed out of the driveway. He did not say goodbye to Margaret. She watched from the upstairs window. I know because I saw her there when I looked up. She was just watching. I do not know what she was feeling. I think it was probably something with no clean name. I filed a formal report with Adult Protective Services. The attorney helped me structure the documentation and submit it properly. I also reported the incident to our bank's Fraud and Elder Abuse Division, and they flagged Daniel's attempt to access the account for their own records. Law enforcement opened an inquiry. I will not go into every detail of that process because it is still ongoing, but I will tell you that the documentation, the camera footage, the bank records, the written statement was sufficient for the inquiry to proceed seriously. Frank came down from Eugene and spent a week with us. He took Margaret to lunch. He watched bad television with her in the evenings. He treated her with the particular gentleness of someone who understands that a person can be damaged in ways that are not immediately visible. Margaret began seeing a therapist. Her cardiologist adjusted one of her medications after reviewing how the past several months had affected her physical health. Her blood pressure had been elevated in ways that her doctor had noted, but we had not connected to what was happening at home. She is doing better now. She will tell you herself if you ask her that she is doing better. But I watch her sometimes at the kitchen table, by the window, at the sink, and I see a small guardedness that was not there before, a checking of exits, an awareness of the room that she never used to have. I notice it. I do not mention it because I do not want to make her feel observed, but I notice it. There are things I have had to sit with. I have had to sit with the fact that the signs were there, and I did not read them clearly enough, quickly enough. I am an engineer. I am trained to look for failure points, to stress test systems, to ask what could go wrong. I applied that discipline to bridges and drainage systems and structural loads for 31 years. I did not apply it to my own home. I trusted the architecture of my family without inspecting the foundations, and that was a failure, and it was mine. I have had to sit with the fact that I love Daniel, and some version of that love is still present, and I do not know what to do with it. It is not a forgiving love, not right now, but it is there, complicated and unwanted, like a piece of furniture you cannot throw away and cannot find a place for. I have had to sit with what Margaret said to me one evening, about a month after Daniel left. We were in the living room after dinner, and she looked at me and said, I should have told you sooner. And I told her that she had told me when she could, and that was true, and I meant it, and I also know that she carries the weight of that delayed telling, and I cannot fully lift it from her, only sit beside it with her. I want to say something directly to anyone who is watching this and who recognizes something in it. The people who exploit aging parents are not always strangers. They are not always visibly monstrous. Sometimes they are people you raised, people you know every scar and habit and preference of, people whose names you said first with pure joy. That is what makes it so difficult to see, and so much more damaging when it is finally visible. If your adult child is isolating you from other family members and calling it protection, that is not protection. If your adult child is monitoring your finances and calling it help, Examine what kind of help it actually is. If you feel afraid to disagree with your own child in your own home, please talk to someone. A sibling, a doctor, a pastor, an attorney, anyone outside the walls of that house. And if you are a spouse, a sibling, a neighbor, and something in someone's behavior seems slightly wrong, slightly dimmed, slightly absent, ask. Ask directly. Ask more than once. Do not do what I did and explain away the silence with convenient theories. I learned something at 63 years old that I would have preferred to learn differently, in a different classroom, with a lower tuition. I learned that protection is not passive, that love is not enough on its own, that sometimes the people in your care need you to act before they can ask you to. Margaret still makes too much food when anyone visits. She still apologizes when someone bumps into her. Last Tuesday, she left a poinsettia on the porch with a note for our mail carrier because it is the holidays, and that is what she does. She is still herself, and I intend to make sure she stays that way for as many years as we have left. In this house we built together, with the door locked and the cameras on, and my eyes open this time. This time, my eyes are open,